Police officers who have arrested other police officers. What's the story? Story 1. Not me, but my dad, who was a cop. He was still working as a full-time cop before switching full-time to firefighting and made a traffic stop around 11 at night back in the mid-80s. Nicer car, speeding well over the speed limit, so my dad initiates a stop. Before he is out of his cruiser, the driver has what looks like a badge hanging out of the window. My dad walks up, does the usual song and dance, and the driver said, "You obviously can't fucking see who I am." My dad says, "Yes, Lieutenant Colonel, I do, and right now I'm conducting a traffic stop." Turns out the driver was a lieutenant colonel in the Ohio State Highway Patrol, which is pretty high up in their rank structure. My dad again asks him for license and insurance, and the guy goes off, threatening to call Dick, as in Dick Celeste, who was governor at the time, and threatening in his job that he was just trying to get back to Columbus after an engagement and so on. Eventually he calls for backup and has another officer there to witness what was going on. Eventually my dad writes him a ticket, and while still screaming, Mr. Pulling Rank drives away. The next shift my dad gets called in by his assistant chief and is asked about the stop, and apparently the colonel of OSP was calling him about it. In the end they had to bring in the other officer to write a statement of what went on, and in the end nothing came of it, except the ticket wasn't contested and paid. Story 2. I actually have had to arrest 3 separate members of the justice system this year. First, a practicing lawyer and former judge who had been utilizing his position to coerce sex from defendants. He utilized this leverage even after he was not a judge anymore. Investigation by DCI revealed he had about a dozen victims, so a warrant for his arrest was made, which I executed. Arresting a guy you use to put defendants in front of is a very odd feeling. He weaseled out of prison time and got it all suspended and put on a direct supervision probation program. Absolute horse shit. I've seen guys do way less and get way more time, but it's not really a secret that money has a habit of tipping the scales of justice. Next was a prison guard who strangled his girlfriend, then stalked her relentlessly. I actually arrested him twice because after he posted bail on the first one, he was spotted lurking outside her home only 45 minutes after being released. He's currently on felony assault, strangulation of a household member, and felony violation of a protection order. He's still in my jail awaiting trial with a bail that has been substantially increased. I'm anticipating prison time for him, but only time will tell. Third was a city police officer. I'm a county deputy sheriff, because we received a call from a 6-year-old that his dad was in the garage doing drugs and wouldn't come out. Showed up to find 4 very young kids running around unsupervised. It was a city police officer smoking meth that he had confiscated during a traffic stop and not reported or turned into evidence. DCI took the case from us due to potential conflict of interest and placed him in another county's jail, and I haven't heard any more about it. Hope he does time too. What kinda asshole leaves his little kids totally alone and unsupervised while they smoke meth? Especially when said person is a fucking cop. Unforgivable in my opinion. But yeah, 2020 has been a very strange year for me. Story 3. This was during my time as a United States Marine Corps MP. Never arrested another police officer during my other gigs. Got a phone call from the guy's wife saying he was drunk and refusing to leave the house. Knocked on the front door, but found him crying on the porch about his wife leaving him because she wasn't happy anymore. She walked by the porch and motioned for me to come inside through the glass door. She proceeded to show me the red marks on her throat, the hole in the door that he punched through beside her head, and some other evidence that doesn't need to be disclosed. After asking him to come inside and get dressed, he refused to leave with me. I wasn't going to handcuff him in front of his kid, but he decided to take that moment to run from me. He was faster and got away for about 5 minutes before I found him walking through a playground a couple building over. Caught up to him, he punched me, but was taken into custody after a slight use of force. On the way to the station, he tried to kick out a window in my cruiser and told me I was ruining his life. He ended up getting charged with about 7 different charges and was kicked out of the Marines. On his way out, he lied to NCIS and got an investigation opened on me for rape. Investigation was completed thoroughly and all charges against me were marked as unsubstantiated, but the charges still showed up after I got out and went through a background check for my security clearance. 10/10 would do again. My slight inconvenience was totally worth it for him to go down for domestic assault charges. Story 4. Ex-sheriff's deputy here. One night on shift I had the great misfortune to be over on the radio that a small local chief of police, the whole department was only 3 people, was not answering a radio call. So my shift partner goes out to the call that they were trying to get him to go to. I make my way to try and locate this chief of police. On my way to the police station thinking maybe he's just asleep on the couch, I see his squad car pull off onto the side of the road. At that moment my heart sank. My first thought was, oh no, this dude just got killed on a traffic stop. As I'm walking up to the car in a hurry, I noticed that he slumped over. I reached into the open driver's window and grabbed his shoulder to try and put my fingers against his neck to feel if he has a pulse or if his skin is still warm, and generally check to see if he is in fact still alive. As I'm doing this, I notice a distinct and strong odor of alcohol as the chief of police wakes up, looks at me, puts the car in drive, and pulls away. About that time, another deputy pulled up behind my car, and I put out my radio that the chief was driving off. The other deputy, forgetting that we all use a shared frequency, then comes over the radio and says, hey, he should be easy to follow if his lights are on. The lights go off. Fast forward to several hours later, command staff are out at the police department, seizing the weapons and evidence that are stored within the department. This chief of police shows up with the mayor of the small town and submits himself to a breathalyzer. He barely passes. Fun fact, district attorneys do not like prosecuting chiefs of police, especially when politics are starting to get involved. Unrelated to that, I was let go about 2 weeks later for calling a suspect an asshole, unprofessional conduct. Story 5, not sure if it counts exactly as ass butt. 2009. I've got a background in law enforcement, so as an Army officer recovering from combat injuries, I found myself as the operations officer for a post/base DES/Department of Emergency Services, which included the MPs and law enforcement for the post/base. My office was across the hall from the actual MP director's office. He stepped in and asked how busy I was. I was busy but wanted any excuse to get away from the monotonous business I was working on, so I said, "Fuck it, what do you need, sir?" He was handling a case personally and wanted another officer as witness in documentation and processing. An officer's wife had been convinced to come in by a couple of other officers' wives. She was a battered mess. Face was swollen, and even though she had cleaned herself up, she was hard to look at without just getting pissed. Female officers, of course, did the actual inspections and physical documentation, but the director was running the investigation himself. He had called the officer off patrol and confronted him with me present as witness. Dude tried joking off that he had just gotten drunk and a little out of control. Long 8-ish month story shortened, his case was transferred to a civilian police department for her good, not from reprisals or anything, for benefits. He was convicted of DV, which put him out of the MPs and lost him his ability to own/carry a firearm, so he was also discharged from the military, losing his career. I believe he also served some time in a civilian jail, but not 100% sure. She was granted a divorce, and because we sent it to a civilian court, and he was not court-martialed, she still got to keep the divorced spouse married for over 10 years benefits for her and the kids instead of losing all benefits, which is why it was transferred to a civilian department. I really liked that director. He did not tolerate BS from among his officers. Story 6. Not a cop yet. Yes, I know, but this is a hilarious story. The city police department had gotten their first internet computer in the early 2000s, and one of the 2 female officers was having trouble with the computer. She had spent an hour screaming, hitting and yelling at it before pulling her gun out and shooting the computer. The other female officer, who was my sister's future MIL, had to take her down and arrest her for unlawful use of a service weapon and destruction of municipal property. The charges were dropped because she asked if she could instead quit without her pension and benefits and go to therapy. Now she's been living life as a grandmother and helping kids with anger issues. Another issue more serious. An officer, same PD, was charged and convicted of unlawfully manufacturing and selling firearms. He was building rifles and pistols and was using a pawn shop to help sell them. Because they had an FFL, Federal Firearms License, and was forcing the owner to sell him parts for a cheaper price. He was also found to be selling the drugs he took off of people. The police department has taken so many hits from these incidents that the city forces them to have multiple cameras in the cars. All officers have to have body cameras they can't turn off unless they're going to the bathroom, which they have to do in the department. They also can't have their guns directly on them at their desks. They have to be locked in a safe next to their desk to deter them from pulling it out and shooting a computer. I have decided not to work there and to find employment with a department that has a better reputation, which sadly is hard. Story 7. I was the head of the unit dealing with sexual offenses and child protection. We served a number of police precincts, called a cluster. A young woman was arrested for theft at one of the police stations that were under us. Her mother was the complainant. The daughter had a serious substance addiction and had previously stolen from her mother, who gave her a last warning after the second to last time. A substantial, for them, amount of cash had gone missing, and when confronted by her mother, the daughter denied any knowledge of it. So deciding that it was time for tough love, she took her daughter to the police station, opened a case, and had her arrested. Later that evening, the mother discovered that instead of hiding the money in the inside pocket of the coat, which was hanging in her wardrobe, she had inserted the envelope containing the cash into the coat sleeve. In other words, no theft had taken place. She immediately returned to the police station, explained to them what had happened, made a withdrawal statement, and was told her daughter would be released imminently. But that, because the case docket was already with the detectives, only they could release her, and not the uniformed police in the charge office. Enter the rotten apple of a detective. Upon hearing that a withdrawal statement had been made, he booked the suspect out of the cells and took her to his office, where he told her that he could make the case go away, if she did something nice for him in return. He then talked her into having sex with him, following which he had her released from custody. Only upon returning home and hearing her mother's profuse apology did the daughter realize what had happened. Cue the rape complaint, the case docket of which ended with me. Long story short, we summarily arrested the detective, a seasoned veteran of more than 15 years' service, recovered the used condom in his office, and he was convicted. I don't remember the exact sentence, but it was in excess of 10 years. Story 8. In my short time in law enforcement, I never arrested another cop, although I did arrest correction officers, both for domestic violence-related incidents. But I did have several officers I knew well who arrested officers from our agency, and even worked with a couple guys who ended up getting arrested. I only knew of one guy catching flack for arresting a fellow officer. The officer arrested was extremely well liked, and the offense was pretty iffy. The kind of thing you wouldn't typically arrest a random person for. However, it came out later that it was just the tip of the iceberg. Most cops I discuss these matters with really have no issue with you if you arrest another cop for legitimate reasons. Professional courtesy is definitely a thing. An officer will likely get the benefit of the doubt. If you commit a borderline act, an officer is likely to turn their head the other way. It's called officer discretion, and most officers will do the same for nurses, teachers, other first responders, or just someone who is kind. But if you have legitimately screwed up, you are most likely going to jail. The cops exist that will do everything they can not to arrest a fellow cop, but they are definitely rarer than the public thinks. Story 9. Used to work for the police and arrested a few cops. First one was my first shift ever on the beat. I was walking around the city and had a complaint about an abusive guy who was calling women sluts and yelling about how ugly they are. I wasn't too fazed. I thought he was probably just drunk. As we walked over to speak with the guy, he started yelling about how he was in his right, and we all agreed. You can have an opinion, but just keep things quiet. It was a very simple conversation, and after taking his details to issue a ticket, he just snapped. He threw his briefcase at my partner and kicked him in the junk. Well, we had a warrant for arrest, so took him down and cuffed him. As we took him down, his glasses broke on his face and cut him up a bit. Nothing major, so we took him back to the holding cell. At this point, he said to me, "Did you know I have a 12-inch cock?" And my real name is Joe Big Blow. We all had a laugh. I finally got some time to run his name through the system and boom. Police inspector, this is one of the highest ranks in Vic Paul. So being an inspector, I called my boss. She came in and said, "Oh fuck, this guy used to teach at the academy, then he runs at her and tries to headbutt her. That doesn't go well and he ends up on the ground with a big lump on his head. Someone gave him a wall to headbutt instead." After a few hours he sobered up and was sent home. The court case carried on for 3 years. I've since left the force and he was fired shortly after that altercation.